Alright, let's do this one last time.
Hey everyone, I'm Afrodo Reviews, and on this channel, I help you decide. Is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery... Yes, it does. Today's book is Love Waits, a Donald James Parker work that was published on May 1st, 2009, and holds the distinction of being the highest rated book on Donald James Parker's Goodreads profile, in that it also has more than 12 reviews and still sits higher than a 2. Thus, why I saved this book for last, where I would read it and see the best Donald James Parker has to offer to make up for any of the bad I had read throughout the rest of the month. Considering I found the Bulldog Compact's worst sin being it's very inoffensively boring for most of it, I won't lie, I did have a little bit of hope that there might be some parts of this book that were actually, well, I wouldn't say good, but I would at least say okay. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing really interesting to say about this book's background. At best, I could probably draw a parallel from this book to the True Love Waits campaign by the evangelical purity groups that was started in 1993. Because if there's one thing that Donald Parker loves to do, is to reference other people's ideas and works in his own. There's also the fact that this book was later adapted into the 2015 Chip Rossetti movie, which did worry me at first, because I thought it was reversed when I realized it was a movie. Well, the movie came first, and I had unintentionally picked up yet another novelization, but thankfully no. And based on what I've seen of the movie, there's some very big changes made from book to movie, and definitely for the better. Before you ask, I will drink a literal gallon of bleach before I do a yes, that was a book episode on Love Waits. So get that out of your mind right away. Let's go on to see what this book wants you to believe it's about. The synopsis on Goodreads would have you believe Sherry is an innocent 14-year-old raised in a small town in Nebraska. Her father lands a promotion, demoting her to a status of nobody in a much larger and inhospitable city. One of the few people she connects with in her new school spills the beans that Jerry is a virgin. Some of her cool schoolmates exert pressure on her to unbuckle the chastity belt. Faced with the loneliness, by the way, I feel like I should clarify, no, not a real chastity belt, because Donald James Parker is that kind of person who would have a real one, so let's just, metaphorical chastity belt. Faced with the loneliness of the new environment and coupled with relationship problems from her father, Sherry finds the temptation growing stronger. When her father recruits a 60-something babysitter, she's ready to rebel. However, she finds that Jean McAllister is no ordinary woman. Jean's womanly wisdom, background as a flute teacher, and love of God provide a counterweight to the peer pressure of Judy Green, the girl who goes on a crusade to convert Sherry to modern morality. When Sherry and Duke Williams, Sherry's new crush, discover the church youth group plans a chastity pledge, they have to decide whether to join or fly solo. I mean, I have problems with the synopsis. For example, those first 3 sentences all happen before the book even starts. Page 1 is literally the character Judy approaching her about being a virgin and offering to set her up with a guy. And the whole rest of the synopsis is over by the halfway point. Literally the entirety of the synopsis is worthless to actually telling you anything about this book. So I'm going to go ahead and largely move on. No, I'm not going to give you my own synopsis. Why, you ask? Well, that's because I've already given it to you. An ignorant old man is hiding behind his religion because he doesn't have to understand anything he doesn't want to understand. In the previous case, it was the Twilight books and vampires. But in this case, it's because he wants to push the values of abstinence, which of course no pro-abstinence thing is complete without all sorts of fear-mongering, which is pretty much the entirety of this book.
If you have sex, your penis will fall off and land in another dimension populated entirely by dogs who will eat it.
Really, the second half is about nothing, but it's also somehow the most disgusting part of the book, but we'll get to that. So before I begin, I'm going to have to say a few mildly competent things this book did. Because when I actually start talking about how bad this book, I might lose track of time and black out in a frenzy. One such thing is that, for once, there is no self-insert character in this story that I could find, at least none that I could really point to and say, there's Donald James Parker wearing a different shirt. Like, literally, there's no point in this book where there's any character that screamed, There's no character in this book that really screamed of DJP self-insert with some ridiculous name and chock full of Mary Sue tendencies. I know in the movie he apparently plays the music teacher Mr. Ireland, but I know the character wasn't originally written for him. Because, well, Mr. Ireland is a rather minor character that our main character disagrees with, and in the narrative's eyes is actually right to do so. If this was actually DJP's original character, Don't Steal, the narrative would have punted Cherry right in the uterus and called her a dumb slut for daring to contradict someone that Donald James Parker saw as himself. A second thing I can give this book credit for is that I can grant the book credit that the chemistry between Duke Williams and Cherry is probably the best I've ever seen out of Donald James Parker from any of his love interests so far. Duke and Cherry actually have a decent chemistry, joking and getting along, spending time together. Ironically, much better than before both become radical Pentecostal Christians. Eventually, yeah, it gets tiring because in Donald's own words in this book, getting to know someone too much causes temptations to run rampant. So there are moments of kind of flirting. It's always the same thing, so it gets very boring, but at least there was some point where I could actually look at these two characters interacting and thinking, okay, yeah, they like each other. But apart from those two things, I really don't have much nice to say about this. No joke, compared to Gramps Goes to College, which I was numb to just due to being exposed to for years before I read the novelization. Against the Twilight, which was hilarious in its absurdity at times and boring at others. And Bulldog Compact, which was just an inoffensively boring book of an old man rambling about his high school career. Love Waits is actually the book that got me to sneer in disgust at Donald. Like, I've hated every argument he's had in literally every book about every minor thing he's had. And in fact, I've made it a point to spell out how hypocritical and dumb they were every time I truly felt it was needed. But this book, I actually had to force myself to finish. And I'll get into that way later when I talk about what actually pissed me off so much about this book. Just know there is going to be a trigger warning involved in the latter half of this review because of how disgusting it gets. For now, let me stick to my regular complaints that I can just tell you guys without having to warn you. This book has all the standard Donald James Parker terrible things. Really bad formatting, constant missing punctuations, words are at least spelled right consistently, enough that I failed to notice anytime they weren't. But the book itself is so badly formatted it's very painful to read. There's also times where Donald clearly doesn't use his words right again. At one point, Duke, the main love interest, comments how he only has one parent, his father. His other parent is a stepdad. And I was surprised for a moment because the way this is worded, it sounds like Donald was putting a gay couple in his book. Like, don't get me wrong, I immediately assumed he did that only so he could demonize them. But at the same time, that meant he still believed in a world where two gay dads could adopt a kid in the early 2000s and raise a relatively normal child. So much so that he's fine with his main character dating him. Only to find out what Donald actually meant by this was that his parents were divorced and that his mom and dad had remarried, which, with his biological dad's wedding day coming up. So, what sense does the sentence make with that in mind? No, Duke, you still have two parents. Your mom is still alive and in fact has more custody over you than your dad. And your dad and mom both remarried, so you wouldn't just have a stepdad, you'd have a stepdad and a soon-to-be stepmom. Which, as a 14-year-old, I'll give him a pass on if it was in his character to reject his step-parents as an actual parents, but this is Donald James Parker, so in Donald's mind, it's probably less that and more that no, if you're a step-parent, you're not a real parent. Also, if you're the mom, you also don't count as a parent. Only fathers matter. Seriously, in this book, he has a character outright say, oh yeah, death is way, way better than divorce. Go fuck yourself, Donald. Donald also does that thing he does in every book, where he shills for people he likes and fellow conservative pundits. About the only time I was really forgivable was during the Bulldog Compact, but even then it was only just barely, and that's just because I felt like Donald was just telling me things that he actually liked on a basis like, hey, I like this, maybe you should go read it. Whereas, again, here, every time you see another media reference, it's literally just Donald going out there saying, hey, here's something that I read that believes in what I believe in. Read it. Read it. Read it. Read it. Hey, Donald, do me a favor. Write your own fucking book first, then worry about whoring yourself out later. Donald also falls into the cardinal sin where almost all of his characters can completely convince anyone on the fence or against his ideals simply by crossing his arms, looking smug, and then saying, but did you ever think about God? Heck, it's honestly kind of impressive when he does even that. In this book, Duke goes from being somewhat hesitant about fully joining his father's church and the abstinence youth group to literally being all about it in like the span of a single day. Like literally, he's reluctant one day to even get further involved in the church and talks about how his mother won't let him join because she sees it as a cult. By the way, good on you, Mom. That's a reasonable reaction. And then the next day he shows up literally like, well, it says here that this, and this. And I believe that supports our arguments. Doesn't it, fellow abstinence Christians? Yes? I thought so. And once more, Donald's belief that if you can't convince people with arguments to join the Pentecostal faith, which this book outright confirms that is the religion he's shilling, then don't worry. You can seduce them into it. Cherry's dad goes from slowly fading away from God to full-on loony because the hot abstinence teacher. And once more, Donald perpetuates the woefully child belief at love at first sight, which in his eyes is actually just God telling you to go marry that person. It has nothing to do with the fact that we as that doesn't exist as a concept. I'm sorry. Love at first sight is not real. One thing he does in other books that I've noted, but he's particularly bad about here, is that he pads the book with a lot of useless subplots and descriptions. In the early book, before Cherry is saved and becomes a preachy bent, she decides to take Judy up on her offer and tries to lose her virginity to Duke. So she creates this whole fake email named after the nickname that Judy had given her, and does this back and forth with him where they hide their identities to solicit sex with each other online. But this whole subplot is literally pointless. Like, actually, genuinely, literally pointless. They don't spend weeks flirting with each other over these accounts, with Duke none the wiser as he's planning to have sex with someone while also trying to get in a relationship with who he thinks is a different person. The charade is up in 10 pages, and the fake email is never again referenced. It's not a lingering bomb to her father to find and freak out about or anything like that. It's just over. There is no point in this subplot in the slightest. And you get that a lot with this book. Constant padding. No, the story can't just have Jean have a phone number to give to Sherry. She's got to ask, be told that she doesn't have the number, then they have to work together to look it up in the church directory, find it through the deductive reasoning of being like, oh, well, her first name was Ariel, so it must be this character, Ariel. And then they call it. We get multiple times where the story will just stop. So the characters can explain the, at the time, modern slang despite being teens who would know it intimately and wouldn't need it explained. It's notable that it's almost always an adult explaining to kids the modern slang, with the kids using super outdated 1950s slang. I'm sorry. In the late 2000s, who in high school was going around being like, oh, you turkey? There was also the entire subplot that made me genuinely hate this book and wasn't at all necessary to it, but again, we'll get to that. So yeah, typical Donald bads. But then we get to the advanced Donald bads. You see, the book itself has Sherry as our main character. It's important to note that her mother died of cancer a few years ago. I know, I bet you've never seen another Christian work where the mother dies of cancer. And she and her father have moved to the big city from the small town Nebraska. The first part of the book deals with this particularly okay by showing us the struggle that Cherry goes through, that she has to fit in, and the fact that Donald has no idea how kids act. By the way, I want to play a fun game throughout this review. Every so often, I'm going to read a quote from this book and end it with a reminder that the characters speaking are supposed to be 14, 13, or 15. Oh, I forgot about that arrangement. Divorce really sucks, doesn't it? You got that right. So does cancer. She blew out a breath. They both rob us kids of our innocence, our joy, and our faith. But anyways, back to my point. Because her mother has died, Sherry's father has forced her to take upon himself because her mother has died, Sherry's father has forced her to take upon herself the housewife duties. As in, literally, he tells her that with her mother dead, someone has to cook and clean the house for him and be the woman of the house. Because he ain't fucking doing that. What is he, a functioning adult? Go fuck yourself. He's not a lady. Seriously, this abuse, which is what it is uncomfortably realistic. Jeff Martin, who's Sherry's dad, never physically assaults her or goes over the top in his verbal abuse, but it's clear he's forcing this girl to take onto her shoulders the domestic responsibility of her mother when she's only 14. And he's weirdly possessive of her as well. At one point, he sees her walking home with the love interest of this movie. Jeff literally skids his car to a halt beside where they're walking, gets out and forces her into the car while then just fucking goes at her for daring to be alone with a boy like a little fucking slut, while assuring Cherry that he knows exactly what Duke wants from her.
We should have never let a boy join! He's obsessed, soiling the sanctity of the group and horning in on our chicks!
And no, she wasn't kissing, hugging, holding hands with, or anyway acting flirty with this boy when he skids to the stop. Not that this would have excused his actions, but it at least would have explained them. Hell, I was literally expecting him to reveal that he found Sherry's password and fake email and knew she was originally planning to meet up with Duke to have sex. To excuse some of his behavior at the very least. But no. The dad knows none of that context and never learns. He was literally only acting like that because he saw his daughter walking home with the boy. To the point that he outright tells her, well, since I clearly can't trust you home alone, you fucking dirty little slut, the neighbor we barely know is now gonna watch you.
I should have seen this coming. You've had way too much freedom lately. I'm moving you back into my bedroom.
He thinks solely with his stomach. He goes on a business trip for 3 days. And when he comes home, what do you think the first thing he says to his daughter is? Hey, Sherry, make me some breakfast. Yeah, over easy eggs. Chop, chop. The problem with this is that clearly the narrative doesn't want me to see him as bad. It has just enough self-awareness in the narrative that it understands the way he's treating his daughter isn't right, but it doesn't seem exactly aware why it isn't right. You see, I bet if I asked Donald James Parker what the father's abuse was supposed to be, it would be that the father strayed from God and wasn't as open with his affections as he should have been. Nothing to do with the fact that he forces his daughter to literally act like a housewife. You remember how I joked in Gramps Goes to College when I talked about how the book actually completed the subplot about Donald going to talk to his estranged daughter, and how it eventually culminates book-wise with him sending one of the children he brainwashes to her door to technically keep his promise about keeping his distance? And then that college student told Donald to stop respecting his daughter's wishes and march up to her house and force himself back into her life, regardless of what his daughter feels, because the Bible says your child is supposed to be submissive to you. And then I made what I thought at the time was a hyperbolic joke about how a girl who was being physically abused by her father had no right to cut out that abusive father from her life, according to this logic. Apparently, Donald actually believes that. No joke, at one point in this book, Sherry flees the neighbor's house for refuge after her father starts to physically intimidate her. And I mean, he's screaming and slamming his hand on the table to silence her, giving the implicit threat that he'll be violent if he doesn't hear what he wants to hear, whether or not he actually planned to. What's the first thing the neighbor does, you ask, when she hears this? She asks, well, did you do something to deserve it? And then she goes on to tell Sherry that, well, while it sucks that her father is abusing her and forcing her to play the part of a housewife in the absence of a woman in his life, unfortunately the Bible says that, Sherry just has to accept it because she has to submit to her father. So yeah, Sherry has to submit to her father's wills. Sherry even asks if there's really nothing she's allowed to do about the abuse she's clearly suffering, and the neighbor's like, no, not unless he tells you to go against God. Otherwise, suck it up, buttercup. And we'll get another dose of how fucked up this view is later. Trust me, it's fucking bad. Oh, it's a puppy break. It's a puppy break. Look, it's a puppy. Look how weird they look. I did. Alright, I'll put you back. And that brings me to my next major annoyance with this book, which is more of an observation than it necessarily is something with the book itself. Donald, how have you written so many novels and so many movies, and you haven't realized that even in your own fantasy worlds, your Christians have to prey upon people who are at their most vulnerable to convert them? In every novel that has to deal with you screaming in the corner about your religion, you constantly have characters dying and resurrecting, coming near death, or people coming into the character's life when they are saying abused by their dad, and some jackass leaning in and telling them, you know, this is because you don't believe in God. The bully character, because Donald literally cannot have a world where a female character who goes against his belief isn't punished in some humiliating and traumatic way, has her face slashed up at the end for no reason whatsoever. Just like literally out of nowhere, it's just like, oh hey, did you guys hear one of our churchgoers wanting to pray for this kid who just got fucked up with a knife? It's Judy Green. What an unbelievable coincidence. Like no, really, it's I can't believe it. What are the odds? Like, why are our parents not freaking out about the fact that there's been a rape and an assault within weeks of each other, both on underage girls? What's going on in this neighborhood? Why is no one reacting to this? Why is people only telling us to worship God? Anyways, because for some reason no one visits Judy in the hospital, two things, by the way, Donald, just because someone is popular and a bully does not automatically mean their friendships are not somewhat genuine. Yes, I know it's a common trope in fiction that typically shows once the bully is humiliated and suffers a loss at the hand of the protagonist, their social status is completely destroyed, meaning that all their friends abandon them. That's not really what happened in this book. She was attacked by random chance for no reason whatsoever about what she did. So why would they all stop being friends with her? And that leads to point number 2. Donald, you are a fucking idiot if you think that no one would visit a popular pretty white girl who was randomly assaulted with a knife in the middle of the night in the hospital. Kids would lie about being her best friend just to go in there because the news is already there doing a 5-hour expose on what happened and trying to leech some of that sympathy popularity that would follow Judy for probably the entirety of her high school career.
Oh, he's got the sympathy factor working for him. His little brother got his arm stuck in a ski lift, tore it right off.
Boy, that sucks.
Not for Frankel. Sure, girls, I'll judge your kissing contest.
Like, literally, she might actually be at a new level of untouchable for a bit because she's not just regular mean. She has the sympathy factor on her side. But no, in his world, this girl who was recently attacked, horribly scarred in a way that's going to haunt her for life, and was abandoned by all of her friends, that's the perfect time to go into a hospital room and preach at her. Now, for a brief moment during this scene, Judy Green was my favorite character in the book, where she outright calls all the people who came into a hospital room and says, you really just came here to fucking preach at me? Are you serious? And I think I would have said she was my favorite and stayed my favorite if she'd kicked them out and that was the last time we ever talked about Judy. But no, since this is a Donald James Parker work, the predatory Christians taking advantage of a person's most vulnerable moment to trick them into believing their specific version of a god is a good thing. I thought it was bad when you had your all-loving eternal daddy actually threatening to kill Stephenie Meyer in your Against the Twilight book, unless she converted to his specific religion. And no, do not feed me any of your fucking bullshit that's not what happened, Donald. God caused her to crash, refused to send her help until she converted to his religion, and then the second she did convert, that's when he sends the vision to her mother to save her, showing he could have done that the entire time. And to remind people, the Stephenie Meyer XP in that book was already Christian. It was just not his version of a Christian. That is how petty and vindictive Donald James Parker idea of a benevolent creator is. And yet he still has the audacity to act like it's shocking when someone like Forrest Valkai says Donald James Parker's idea of heaven sounds awful. And I bring this up because if you tweet very little about this book, you could turn it into a genuine horror story. Think about it. A small town Nebraska girl moves to a big city after the death of her mother. Because she's new in her town, she's been isolated by her community who hold values she's not familiar with. And her own father has a promotion, which means he works most of the day, and when he is home, he forces her to take on housewife duties. After her father freaks out after catching her daring to walk home alone with a boy, she's forced to go to an old neighbor's house she barely knows while her father is out on a business trip. On the first day there, her neighbor immediately starts babbling in fucking tongues while they pray, spouting the glory of her deity. Then she turns to him and says, "My God says you've misbehaved." And the rest of the book is about the neighbor further brainwashing Sherry into her cult while slowly teaching her to accept unacceptable abuse from her father, while also teaching her to act as an agent for that religion, trying to convert her father and then immediately moving on to separate her father from any outside influences that would rightly point out how terrible this is. Seriously, there's at one point that her father gets a new girlfriend. Okay, yeah, no, I gotta say this one. Seriously, at one point, her father gets a new girlfriend named Gloria. And for no reason whatsoever, well, I mean, the reason is that Donald James Parker is a misogynistic prick, but there's no reason in universe for it. Sherry just fucking despises this lady. First, she outright purposely cockblocks her dad by refusing to leave when she clearly realizes that she walked in on her father trying to get lucky while she was out at the neighbor's. Then, just throughout the rest of the book where Gloria was relevant, Sherry just constantly thinks to herself how much of a dumb, heathenistic bimbo she is. Like, literally for no reason. Like, the narrative at one point wants you to believe that Sherry thinks Gloria is a bad influence on her father, dragging him deeper into alcoholism, that Gloria doesn't want anything more from Jeff Martin to have fun. But Donald literally wrote into this book where Gloria acknowledges that she wants to date Sherry's dad, and that means she and Sherry need to get to know each other and get along. Like, she's trying to be nice to Sherry, who at this point has been nothing but a fucking bitch to her, and even goes on to defend the fact that Sherry likes to play flute and wants to go to church, even if Gloria herself doesn't want to. This lady is pretty nice throughout the book. So what exactly was wrong with her? Okay, never mind, Jerry. You can have this one. I'm just like looking at a fucking skinwalker. Seriously, get it off the screen. Get it off the screen. Get it off the screen before it crawls out of my fucking. But let's move on to this whole abstinence thing. Mostly because I'm going to be saving the heaviest subject for the last part of the video because I honestly won't really feel like continuing this review after. I'm not even gonna lie to you. It's bad. So when it comes to the abstinence of the book, or just abstinence in general, I admit I'm pretty neutral on the concept, but I'm definitely against how most Christians use it. This book itself is a prime example of how dumb they are about abstinence. Seriously, these abstinence youth groups are easily the worst fucking part of the book, barring, again, the parts I'm going to talk about later. And even then, that's intertwined with it. So technically, these are the worst parts of the book. Now, in theory, I have no qualms about someone who wants to be abstinent or abstinate or whatever the proper term is here. If that's what you want to do, then fine, do it. Your virginity isn't some magical thing that you're unclean for not having. But at the same time, I completely understand why it would mean something to many people and why they want their first time to be with someone special. If you want to save yourself a marriage, then yeah, do it. But don't let abstinence be the only form of sexual education you get. Inform yourselves. Because the way the book tells you to think about it is beyond dumb. Right off the bat, it tried to discredit the actual factual statement that abstinence-only sexual education is extremely ineffective, to the point that I think it's actually classified as the worst form of sexual education, with hilariously terrible rebuttals. My favorite is when they say, well, obviously abstinence works 100% of the time. Because the second you have sex with someone, it's not abstinence anymore. Therefore, it can't be counted against abstinence. Which is, wow, such a wonderfully insincere way of addressing the point. By this logic, every method of birth control works 100% of the time. Because, say, if you're using a condom and it breaks, well, then obviously you aren't using a condom anymore. Therefore, it can't be counted against condoms. You see how that logic doesn't make any fucking sense when you apply it to anything else?
Because not only do condoms fail 100% of the time, they're also majorly unsafe. Hey, you wouldn't put a plastic bag over your grandmother's head, would you? No.
And Donald even addresses some of the problems abstinence causes, but he lacks the self-awareness to realize that. Realize this is why abstinence isn't liked very much. Duke's father dates a woman for only about 6 months before deciding to marry her. And actually, considering that the book takes place over the course of definitely longer than a month, it's probably more accurate to say his father knew this lady for about 4 months before proposing, and they're only being married 6 months after they knew each other. At one point, Donald even has Sherry and Duke talk about getting married at the age of 14, so they can be together. Donald acknowledges things like abstinence leading to premature marriages because people aren't allowed to fully explore their relationship with each other, so they rush into commitments before truly knowing each other. But then he just reasons away while saying, oh, well, people who do that aren't actually abstinent, so they don't count. And that pretty much sums up how Donald argues in favor of abstinence and pushes off all criticism of it throughout the book. You literally can even see the tactics he'd use in real life on display. The entire youth group is just a constant stream of fear-mongering bullshit, even in his own book. He literally has the abstinence teacher compare premarital sex to rape. He has the fucking balls to say, well, if we're gonna charge football players who grope women unconsensually, we have to also charge people for premarital sex because they're basically the same thing. And when one kid even outright points out how bullshit of a reasoning that is, he doesn't actually get a response. It's just there so his fictional abstinence teacher can stomp over to him, put her hands on her hips, and then lord dump about how she's not even a real woman anymore because she had premarital sex once, got pregnant, got an abortion, and then the abortion clinic confiscated her uterus afterwards.
In his pamphlets Meg brought home from school, sex turns straight people gay and turns gays into Mexicans. Everyone goes down a notch.
Like the scene clearly does not address any of the points, but it's just trying to shock any detractors out of having any actual response by sharing a deeply traumatic and personal story laced with deep-seated misogyny. Another puppy break. Another puppy break, y'all. Oh, puppy breath. Puppy breath. By the way, this is my favorite. Hey, remember, this is a 14-year-old boy in the late 2000s saying this. Another unlawful practice in some circles is causing some controversy. Who can tell me what pornography is? Only Duke raised his hand. This time he read from a piece of paper he took out of his pocket. I thought this topic might come up, so I wrote down this blurb from the internet. Porn, or pornography, is the explicit depiction of sexual subject matter with the sole intention of sexually exciting the viewer. By the way, according to Donald, porn is the reason people rape each other. Donald, take what I said earlier and make it a rusty metal cactus while you're at it. That's the entirety of the youth group scenes. He even tries to get ahead of the, okay, well, I mean, it's not technically breaking our abstinence vow if we do this.
To have a talk. Mom! Oh my God! You kids were doing it in the ear!
I have an extended rant about how terrible kink is, as if the act of two people in a loving relationship consenting to both the same thing is an act of sin and terribleness. Again, rusty metal cactus, Donald. And it's funny because even at one point, Donald seems to understand how much of a fucking bore that the Pentecostal Christians are, at least the specific denomination he's part of, and tries to desperately reassure us that being this Pentecostal Christian can in fact be fun, and then fails to give any adequate reason that it would be considered that. Because by his own belief, you literally cannot fucking do anything because it's against the Bible. Like, literally, because I read books, as an example, you can't read fucking anything. Because everything in the Bible forbids it. Heck, I'll be honest, I bet I could take a fine-tooth comb and knock out a majority of his book by the Leviticus laws he claims you need to follow so intently that Twilight is a fucking sin to read. It's funny because he does this a lot, like with Miss McAllister or Jean. For some reason, she just lore dumps her traumatic backstory on a 14-year-old neighbor twice. The first time, Sherry asks a reasonable question, hey, where's your family? And Jean is just like, oh, my husband and daughter wrapped the car around a tree a few years ago. Really sucks. The other one's in Seattle, though. Again, this is a 14-year-old kid she met that day. What kind of, like, I get that's what actually, by the way, this isn't even what happened. This is her made-up story. So, she just met a kid that day, and the first thing she tells him about her family isn't that, oh, they're not really around anymore. She goes full on, no, they died in a car crash. It was brutal. My husband's arm was like across the street. You could see the trail of blood leading to it. She like why? The other is where Donald has Judy steal Cherry's flute, and so Jean decides to tell the true story of what happened. How her daughter actually got hooked on drugs and then hit Control-Alt-Delete on herself. And her husband that same night got blind drunk and drove around town until he wrapped the car around his tree. And in order to spare herself the humiliation, because for some reason that's humiliating, she tells everyone that her kids they both just died in a car wreck. They both just died in a car wreck. Why does Jean share this? How does this enhance the scene in any way? How does it enhance the character in any way? What part does it actually play in the book? I don't fucking know. Here's your flute, Cherry. Like, I don't even get this. Donald, it seems like Donald's trying to retroactively give Jean some more characterization with this, by using it to say that Jean was reluctant to teach flute again because the last student was her own daughter. But, well, that clearly isn't true because Jean literally wasted no time in teaching Sherry again. We didn't see the reluctance slowly fizzle out as Jean took more and more of an interest. We don't see Jean slowly coming to see this as a surrogate daughter. Literally within a day, there's like, oh, you're my adopted grandmother. I love you. I'm so touch-starved. Hug me again so I can cry. Sherry mentioned she plays the flute and Jean's like, no shit. Get that thing out here. Let's do this. I'm teaching you how to play. But let's really go into the thing that made me hate this book. And for this section, like I said, I'm actually going to attach a trigger warning to this because Donald decided he was going to tackle some very serious subjects in this book, and he just does not have anything remotely qualified to let him do that. I've long expected Donald to being racist. You can see it in the way he writes his black characters. They serve mostly as mouthpieces for his own opinions or serve as antagonists. You can tell by the way he writes in the same way that he's writing youth people. He's not writing them as people. He wants them to be mouthpieces. He wants these people to say what he actually wants to say about them, but he knows if he says it, it sounds bad. Again, one of the major things to realize is that people like Donald don't believe they're racist because they aren't donning a white hood and shouting the N-word while burning a cross on their neighbor's lawn. It comes in the small acts, like how they portray their characters or how they write about them, or, for example, doing things like this. She veered to her left to avoid a group of black girls. In her small city of Nebraska, there had not been any blacks. She had no prejudice, but she was a little scared. She'd seen movies about the tough girls in the city and wanted to stay clear of potential trouble. Now, I really shouldn't have to point out why this is racist, and no, Sherry's thoughts about this are never shown in any way wrong or addressed in any possible way. But we got bigger issues to tackle, so let's please move on. Let's talk about Tiffany. Her mother works 3 jobs to keep them afloat, and her dad ran out on her. So Donald James Parker's sole black character is a poor person whose father ran out on her. And at one point, although he never clarifies these teens are black, but I'd put money on it just because, 1, they're talking to the one black character of the book, and 2, it's the way he writes them that I can definitely see Donald picturing the stereotypical gang member as a black guy. So he has the guy, like, it's just the way they talk, the way they act in that scene, and what they eventually do. That's not even the most disgusting thing that happens with the character of Tiffany. I bring this up just so you understand how terrible what Donald James Parker does to Tiffany. Because you see, he's got a big old fridge he plans to shove her into. You see, Tiffany gets in this book. Sherry and her group stumble upon the act, and yeah, this act does not occur for Donald to do anything but to use it to push the characterization of other characters and to shove his religious beliefs in more. It's there to facilitate Sherry's very real question about how Tiffany, a devoted acolyte of God in the way that Donald thinks is the right way, is attacked in a horrible way, and having Sherry question why God will allow something like that to happen. No one actually provides a good answer for her, by the way. They just tell her, hey, suck it up. Bad things happen. By the way, I asked 5 people I work with, what is the little worst thing you think you could do in a scenario where someone close to you has one of their friends? All of them told me that the worst thing you could do was somehow insinuate that it was the victim's fault. 3 guesses on what thing Donald decides to do in this book. The first 2 don't count. Add barbed wire to that cactus, Donald. He also uses her as a prop for the abortion debate, because obviously he has to have a 15-year-old rape victim in his book get pregnant as well with her attacker's child. Also, he can rant about how bad abortion is for any reason, with Tiffany herself even refusing to do so, claiming this one guy she likes was a rape baby, and if her mom had aborted him, then he wouldn't be around, obviously. Therefore, no one should abort them. But yeah, what if that fetus ends up being the next Hitler? You want to play this game, Donald? Let's play it. There's an equal amount of chance that the fetus that you're talking about comes out as the worst human being in the world and creates great harm. What if this fetus would go on to lead a movement where he eradicates the Christian faith from the world? If you knew that, without a doubt, that 100% would happen, would you still argue about it? Would you say, no, it's not right? Or would you be one of those people like, oh no, I'm not like other people who do this. I'm just doing this because I'm not a slut, but I have reasons. Because something tells me you're that type of person, Donald. But that's not what I'm here to debate. There's also a point where Donald has Tiffany ask Sherry to go with her to jail after her attackers are caught. Because this 15-year-old rape victim, whose entire life has been irreparably destroyed by these 4 attackers, has to forgive them. Sherry is somehow the most reasonable person here, not understanding how on earth someone could just forgive someone like that, and is actually talked down to by other members who point out that God tells you to forgive them, so shut the fuck up and come help me forgive them. Yeah, you know what? Deuteronomy also says that these rapists have to pay Tiffany's father 50 shekels and then marry her. We gonna do that too, Donald? Anyways, this ultimately leads to Becky, who, like Duke, started the book very clearly skeptical and distrusting of religious authority, but for no reason whatsoever just decided to go to church with them and became a regular goer. But anyways, this leads to Becky revealing that she, too, was by one of her cousins, and her father covered it up to protect his brother and the cousin. And of course, because this is a Donald James Parker book, this doesn't come with any form of therapy, deep, meaningful conversion, or anything like that. They just put her in a prayer circle and pray over her. And since we know Pentecostal Christians pray in tongues, this is literally a group of people standing around someone babbling in tongues as they start crying and claim they were touched by some other spirit. Again, Donald, how do you write this shit and not think, oh yeah, if I was writing Satanist, this is exactly what I would write? And of course, just like before, Becky realizes that she has to forgive her father for his trespasses. No addressment of the fact that in the story she tells her own father is angry at her for getting raped. Never mind the fact that he covered it up for the benefit of his brother and nephew. Never mind the fact that he let his little girl get fucking abused and had one of the most horrible things happen to her. No. It's clearly on Becky to forgive them for what they do. No one else here is at fault. No one's going to report her father to CPS, call the cops, or anything. Clearly, the only proper fucking solution here is to pray for the people who commit the crime and then be forced to forgive them. Make that fucking cactus white hot in temperature, Donald. I gotta be honest with you guys. After these scenes, I just kind of mentally checked out of the book. I had to because I've never been so genuinely enraged by a book before. For Donald to be such a pathetic little bitch about the serious subject, all in an attempt to push his religion, really bothers me. I mean, you know it's bad when the movie is adapted and they just leave out the entirety of the Tiffany subplot. Like, Chip Rossetti himself didn't let you put this in the film, Donald. Does that not send alarm bells off in your head that maybe you should take a look at yourself? Yeah, by the way, this is Tiffany in the movie. Jesus, not that again. The other one. Get it off my screen. This isn't a fucking analog horror series. Yeah, I'm noticing a very difference in complexion here, Donald. You think there's a reason for that? Now, I'm going to choose to believe that someone in that production actually had a fucking soul and told Donald that this part of the book is incredibly offensive and that they weren't going to film it. But I also acknowledge that it's more likely that Donald Shush just didn't have enough black patrons so that he had an actress that was both young enough to be in the role by her parents. But yeah, I'm sorry if I don't bring up much more beyond this. Everything past this point was kind of a haze for me because I kind of wanted to break my phone and pretend I never gave this book any attention. Yeah, I did read it. They go on to pray Judy's emotional, vulnerable moment to convert her to religion, etc., etc., etc. In the end, I found this book probably the worst of the 4 books I read, without a doubt. Gramps Goes to College, Against the Twilight, the Bulldog Compact, all come off like wish fulfillment fantasies Donald wrote about himself. But this one time, he seemed to write a book that doesn't include himself in any way. And what do you know? It's probably one of the books I found the most terrible. And I don't just mean of the Donald James Parker universe. For that reason, I would give this book a firm 2 out of 10.
No, God! No, God, please, no!
This is the book that I found most pathetic of all the Donald James Parker works. I got a little personal against Donald in this one, and honestly, I don't feel it was unwarranted. Because for me, this isn't like reading a William C. Deeds book or James Patterson, where the stories they write are bad, and I do have personal issues with how they write them, but I don't really have a problem with them as people. I do have a problem with Donald James Parker as a person. And these books reflect why, because these aren't stories that are meant to entertain. They're stories that are meant to preach about his values and then complain about others' values. This is Donald James Parker in book form. These are the things he thinks are all right, and these are the things he would force on society if he was given the choice. That being said, I think this should go without saying, obviously, I'd like to think I have an audience of mostly mature adults, but do not go to harass Donald James Parker in real life. He's not a great person, but regardless of what he believes or what he writes or what he puts out there in film form, we don't need to go out there and harass him in real life. Not only would this prove Donald James Parker right in his belief, but he's just not worth it, guys. Let's all be mature adults and hate his stuff like mature adults. With that being said, I'm glad this romp is over. I was briefly debating near the early stages of this book if I was going to read another Donald James Parker book this month. Since they're relatively small, and with as boring as the Bulldog Compact was, I kind of wanted to see another one of his more crazy books. I was thinking, well, maybe one of the Trump books, right? That'll be fun. But no, this book was so genuinely angering to me that I actually had to stop reading it midway and go find a book I thought would actually be a good palate cleanser. By the way, that's John Scalzi's Red Shirts is the one I chose. It's a pretty decent one so far. I'm a little mixed on how it's approaching the meta commentary of Star Trek so far, but I'm still holding out hope. This is definitely something I'm going to have to wait till the end before I form a full opinion on it. So the first 10 pages of this book, not counting the prologue, are basically just the characters sitting around in a bar and meeting each other and just talking a bit about each other, sharing backstory and exposition. And all 10 of those pages are better than every single one of the 800 pages of Donald slop I read this month. I'll let you guys know what my final verdict on this book is when I finish it, but yeah, it'll probably be a September book, maybe. I haven't decided yet. But for now, I'm done with Donald James Parker. Maybe I'll revisit him after taking a year to decompress and tackle some of his other books, or maybe I'll just pretend Donald James Parker no longer exists after this. I'll decide eventually, but for now, it's over. That being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every I'm gonna cut that part. I don't feel like that doesn't feel like it applies here. But yeah. See you later, everyone.